Through all of what we did last week, but right now we're going through a series on money. We're specifically going through a series on giving, and we're trying to be systematic in going through what Scripture says to us about how God's people give of their resources. And so last week we started, we're going to take last week and this week to be just in the Old Testament, and then next week we're going to move to the New Testament, and there's lots to talk about. And so last week we talked about tithing. So we talked about in the Old Testament, there's three ways that God's people are called to give. One is tithing. So we talked about that last week, which is simply a 10%. We're all pretty familiar with the concept. We talked about who the tithe is for the Levites, for the giver of the tithe. They get to eat of their own tithe. Some of the tithe goes to the poor as well. Tithing in the Old Testament is not voluntary. It's commanded. God says, if you're going to be my people, this is what you're going to do with your money. 10% is going to come to me. And so today, we're going to talk about the next two, which are the offerings and care for the poor. So it's not just tithing in the Old Testament. There's three kinds of giving. And so we'll hopefully get through 2 and 3. Any burning thoughts or questions out of last week, or things that you wanted clarification or to bring up about tithing? We will get to the New Testament on tithing and what are Christians supposed to do with this Old Testament command. Do we keep it or not? And we'll talk about that. Is there any reason why it's 10% and not 5 or 20 or whatever? That's a great question, Dave. I don't have any answer that I can pull out of my brain for that one. You did, right off the bat. Well done. Anybody have an answer? Why is it 10% and not 20 or 5? Or I don't think Scripture ever explains. It just says this is what it is. It's a nice round number. Why not a 12th? 12 is good, or 7? All right, shows how little I know, or maybe none of us know. So that's tithing. Offerings are different. We talk often about our tithes and offerings, right? And that's such a Christian term that we don't even think about what that means, or tithes and offerings. But tithes and offerings are very different things. And so last week was tithes. This week we're going to talk about offerings. So the word for offering is korban, which we actually see in the New Testament in one place, and it's literally that which is brought near to God. Offerings are, in a sense, optional. Tithing's not optional. Offerings, in a sense, they're occasional. There's different times where you would give God an offering. But there's certainly a voluntary kind of aspect to what offerings are. So next week, we're done our preaching series on politics today. And then next week, we're going to go into Leviticus. And this kind of lines up perfectly because I thought, how am I going to preach through Leviticus? Because it starts off with all these offerings. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about Leviticus and the offerings today, because this is part of how God's people give. So in your Bibles, in Leviticus, the first few chapters of Leviticus all start off with instructions on how to give offerings. Chapter 1 is about how to do a burnt offering. Chapter 2 is about how to do a grain offering. Chapter 3 is about a peace offering. Chapter 4 is about a sin offering. And so Leviticus starts off with all these instructions for here's how you do these offerings. So I'm going to read a little bit from Leviticus chapter 1, just to give us a sense of context of how God's people give in offerings. So I'll read chapter 1, verses 1 to 9. I'll maybe start at verse 3 here. The Lord called Moses and spoke to him from the tent of meeting. So this is the tabernacle set up. It says, "Speak to the people of Israel and say to them, when any of you brings an offering to the Lord, you shall bring your offering of livestock from the herd or from the flock." So we're talking about cattle and sheep. "If his offering is a burnt offering from the herd, he shall offer a male without blemish." So you find a male cattle. What's a male cow? It's a steer, a bull. These are bulls, actually. You find a bull without blemish, so a good-looking bull. You shall bring it to the entrance of the tent of the meeting, that he may be accepted before the Lord. He shall lay his hand on the head of the burnt offering, and it shall be accepted for him to make atonement for him. Then he shall kill the bull before the Lord. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall bring the blood and throw the blood against the sides of the altar that is at the entrance of the tent of meeting. Then he shall flay or skin the burnt offering and cut it into pieces. And the sons of Aaron, the priest, shall put fire on the altar and arrange wood on the fire. And Aaron's sons, the priests, shall arrange the pieces, the head and the fat, on the wood that is on the fire on the altar. But its entrails and its legs he shall wash with water. And the priest shall burn all of it on the altar as a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So the early temple would have looked and smelled a lot like a butcher shop. There was lots of butchering of animals going on. So the animal is, the man puts his hand on it, it's killed, the blood is taken and put on the altar, it's skinned there, and it's cut up, and it's laid on the altar like a meal, in a sense, for God. Though God is not hungry like other gods. And this offering is always, we see, to the Lord. The burnt offering is to the Lord, a grain offering to the Lord. So when we talk about tithes, remember that lots of the tithes went to support the Levites, right? They're working in the temple. They need to eat too. So there's a practical sense to the tithe. But the offering is not, well, some of it is, but most of it is strictly, this is for the Lord. And so like a burnt offering, you take that whole bull and you burn the whole thing up to the Lord. It happens at the entrance to the tent of meetings. This is as close as you could get to the presence of the Lord. And so all of this is, there's a sense of going up. The word for this burnt offering is to ascend or to go up. So you go up to Jerusalem from wherever you live, you go up to the temple, and then you go up on the altar, and then the altar goes up to the Lord. Part of this is for atonement. We saw that in there. He shall lay his head. So if I was an Israelite and I bring my bull before God, I put my hand on the head of this animal. I'm involved very much in this process. This is my bull. I've raised it from a calf, and I've had this bull, and now I'm going to offer it. I'm going to give this bull to the Lord. And part of my giving is I put my hand on the head of this animal, and it's accepted to make atonement. Because there's a sense of how God's people are all falling short because of the sin that we have in us, and we need to do something to make ourselves presentable to God. And God gives us this avenue of sacrifice. And so the animal, in a sense, takes the death that should be on me because of my sin, and it plays a role in providing atonement for the worshiper. So in this giving, you're not spectators. You're not just sitting there watching all this happen. You are playing a role in this. You bring your animal, you lay your own hands on that animal, and you kill that animal as well. So you're the one there with the knife doing the nitty-gritty. And then the priests come in and they take care of the animal and make it appropriate to offer. It's a long ways from passing the plates right down the aisle. But this is a part of how God's people gave. And the priest shall offer all of it, the animal, and burn it on the altar. It is a burnt offering, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. So this whole animal is burnt. You don't eat it. Some of the offerings are burnt and some people eat of it, but a burnt offering, you take this whole animal and you burn it. Anybody ever burnt an animal? Anybody ever burnt a cow in here? What's it like for those of you who've done it? Describe this whole experience.
It's not easy to do. And have you ever wondered where they got all the wood to do the burnt offering?
Yeah.
In the desert?
Yeah. It's not easy. Animals don't burn that well. Other thoughts? You guys have burned animals? It stinks. Yeah. The temple to our noses was not a pleasing aroma. And yet it's exactly what it is to the Lord, right? It's like, and not in the sense that God is pleased with that smell, but pleased, maybe he is. I don't know. God certainly could be. it's a big deal to burn an animal. And yeah, like you say, you need a lot of wood. And so this altar is set up, a place to have wood, I think, underneath it to get this fire going. And I guess animals are somewhat flammable if they're fatty. I don't know. But this whole thing has to get burned up. There's other offerings. We'll get into some of this more about the whole burnt offering. There's a grain offering. We're not going to go through all these offerings in details. So the first offering in chapter 1 is an animal. The second one is from your field. It's the oats and the grain and the flax and whatever else you're growing. And from it you take a handful of the fine flour, so it's already ground up into flour, and oil, and with frankincense, and the priest shall burn this as a memorial portion on the altar, a food offering with a pleasing aroma to the Lord. But the rest of the grain offering shall be for Aaron and his sons. So some of this here is eaten by the priests, but again, a piece of it is burned up before God. There's a chapter 3, there's the peace offering or the fellowship offering. This is again a burnt offering. If your offering is a fellowship offering and you offer an animal from the herd, whether male or female, you are to present the Lord an animal without defect. So this one can be a male or a female, but it's again without defect. And there's different occasions. So the Bible tells us this is how you do it, but doesn't say why to do it, but it does tell us sometimes when to do it. So when there was a new priest, you would do this kind of offering. At the Feast of Weeks, you would do this. At the completion of a Nazirite vow. But again, these are free will offerings. You don't have to do this kind of offering. It's a big deal if you're a small farmer to bring one of your cattle and offer it before the Lord, right? Like, think if this is your whole livelihood, this is a big gift that you can give to the Lord if you want to give that gift to the Lord. One more, there's the sin offering. When anyone sins unintentionally and does what is forbidden in any of the Lord's command. And here's another offering where I've got sin in my life, and so I want to go, and part of me dealing with my sin is bringing this gift to the Lord. Not that I'm purchasing my forgiveness or anything, but part of me being atoned for is making a sacrifice, and so that sacrifice is an animal. So there's lots of occasions for these offerings. You can sin, Thanksgiving. So we got Sam and Marissa who just had a baby yesterday. If they were ancient Israelites, they would go to the temple in the next few weeks, and they would bring an animal according to their wealth, and they would offer that as a thanks offering to the Lord. So it could be a bull, it could be a couple of pigeons or whatever they can bring, but they would bring an animal and they would give this to God and say, we want to thank you for the birth of our son. So there was different occasions to give these kind of gifts. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know. You think of what it takes. There's only one altar, right? You can't burn all of that on one altar. So they had other things going on, other places to sacrifice, and sometimes numbers can be symbolic. I don't know. It's an insane amount of offerings. Yeah. So I'll give you a picture. It's a good question because it leads into my next slide. Here's the basic yearly offerings at the temple, and this is just the very basic level of offerings. So every day at the temple, the priests offered 2 lambs, morning and night. So not too big a deal, right? You can burn 2 sheep in a day. But if it was a Sabbath, there was 2 extras. So on that day, you would offer 4 sheep. On the first of the month, so that happened 13 times a year, right? I think there was 13 months. You have 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, and 1 male goat. That's a lot. Then when the Passover came around, you had 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, and 1 male goat. The Feast of Weeks, 2 bulls, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, 1 male goat. The Feast of Trumpets, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, and 1 male goat. Then you come to the Day of Atonement, 1 bull, 1 ram, 7 male lambs, 1 male goat. The Feast of Booths, this one's really interesting because it's a 2-week-long feast. And on the first day, you do 13 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 male goat. The second day, 12 bulls, 2 rams, 14 male lambs, 1 male goat. Day 3, 11. It's like the 12 days of Christmas. Every day it's one less. That's a lot of animals to be offered at the temple. So this is my rough math. In a year, you've got 436 sheep, 100 bulls, 23 goats as burnt offerings in the temple that are burnt up completely. And these are just the basic offerings. This does not include the couple who just had a baby and they want to bring an animal as part of that offering, or the person who has sinned and they want to bring an animal for a sin offering. That's a lot of offering. That's a lot of animals. This fire would just be continually going at the temple in this altar. And these priests, they had full-time jobs as what we would think of as butchers, because there was always animals coming in, always animals to be prepared, always animals to get up on the altar, keep that wood going and harvesting that wood from wherever they're going to get the wood. A whole lot going on to offer these animals as offerings to God. It's very different than what we think of as just where we pass the plate. Our giving is so neat and tidy, right? Nobody ever gets blood on their hands when they're giving their offering on a Sunday morning. But when you gave to God, you got blood on your hands, right? You got involved in this process. So I want to ask a question. What about the wastefulness or the imprudence or the impracticality of taking these perfectly fine animals who could be eaten by people and putting them on an altar and burning this whole thing until there's nothing left? When you sin, why can't you just say, "Sorry, God, I sinned"? Why do you have to bring an animal? When you have the birth of a child, why can't you just say, "Thanks, God, for this baby"? Why do you bring an animal to offer for the birth of a child? Yeah, that's a good example, Dave. When Mary anointed Jesus with the perfume, and it was Judas Iscariot, right, who said, this perfume could have been sold, the money given to the poor, a very practical thing to do. And Jesus says, no, what she has done has been good for me. Worship isn't always practical. Burning a whole animal, and animals were currency, right? There was a bit of currency going around back then, but not a lot. It was mostly a barter and a trade system. So burning a whole animal is similar to burning a stack of money, when we think about it that way. How much is a bull these days? Anybody know a price? I did some Googling. I found kind of 5,000 to 10,000. Does that sound fair? It's going to be fair, because that's what Google said. We're going to go with $5,000 for a bull. And you are called to take that bull and offer it as a sacrifice, the whole thing. You're not eating it, your family's not eating it, nobody's eating of this bull. That's like burning $150 bills. Because animals are currency. This money's not going to the poor. This bull is not being, sent off to the food pantry to help those less fortunate. The whole thing is being burnt up. What if part of our worship on a Sunday morning was the plate comes by, and let's pretend there's no e-transfers or checks, and you take out your wallet and you take out some cash and you put it in the bag as it goes by. But some of your cash you bring to the front, and we have a little altar here, and you put your money in there, and we have a match and we light it on fire. And that's part of our worship on a Sunday morning. I'm not suggesting we do that. But the idea of burning a whole animal is not far from that. The animals are currency. They are their livelihood, and they are burning the whole thing up before God. Tell me your thoughts or your questions on this. What's that? It doesn't make sense. It's not practical. Is it about obedience? Absolutely. Yeah. It's an act of trust, of saying, this bull, which I only have 5 of, I'm going to take this one and I'm going to offer it because I'm going to trust that you're going to take care of me. Yeah, I think it's very much about trust.
I think that we miss a lot of the sacrifices, also the not working on the Sabbath. These are God's way of saying, look, if you're my people, I'll take care of you, whether you take a day off every week, whether you give stuff away or burn stuff, I'll make sure you have enough.
Yeah. Yeah, it's God's way of saying, I will take care of you. I will make sure you have enough.
It keeps God in perspective. The money, the bull, it's just all meaningless. You might as well burn it. Because in
Okay.
the picture, it really is meaningless.
Keeps things in perspective. The money and the bull they're fleeting things, right? That bull's not going to last forever. The money's not going to last forever. And when you die, you're not taking either of them with you. So burning it is a way of saying, I'm not hanging on to this. Yeah. There has to be some, and obviously we're not called to do this as Christians today, right? We don't have a temple. We don't sacrifice animals. But the idea of an impractical gift to God, of saying, this doesn't make any financial sense at all to do this. But I do this out of obedience. I do this out of trust. I do this to say, this is an act of worship. I really think for many of us, our act of giving our money can be and should be as much or more of a worshipful experience than singing a song on Sunday morning. Because worship is giving to God what is most precious to you. And if you're a small farmer with a few cattle and just trying to raise your family, and you take one of those animals and you offer it to God, you have given what is most precious to you and say, God, this is nothing compared to you. I give this to you. So worship is always giving what is most valuable, what is most precious to us, even when it's not practical. Right? Like I can give, because I want to help the poor, so I'll give this money and so on. This picture of giving is not practical, but it is simply saying, I will not let possessions have a hold on my life. And the act of giving actually weakens that hold that it has. So if you're struggling with greed, the best thing that you can do is to give. That breaks greed in your life. I have found that to be very true in my life. Giving is the opposite of greed. It's the opposite of practicality. Romans 12, maybe this is how we incorporate this. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, not to offer your bulls or your sheep as a living sacrifice, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Worship is giving, whether it's a bull, whether it's a stack of money, whether it's your whole life. Worship and giving are very much the same thing. So that's what I have on offerings. We'll talk about care for the poor a little bit, but other thoughts percolating through your heads as we think about these offerings.
Well, you talked about sacrifices here, and that's quite different than offerings in a sense, because even from my own self, how much of what I give is sacrificial? It works out.
Yeah.
But how far do most of us go in sacrificial giving?
Yeah, and I think once we get into the New Testament, we'll get a better picture of that sacrificial type of giving, right? Of like, often it's far more than 10%, right? It's people giving really sacrificially to the point where it hurts. And yeah, we don't always see that when we look at these offerings. We don't know how much it cost that farmer to bring his bull in as a sacrifice, right? Was that 1 out of 300 cows that he has, or was it 1 out of 3, right? Sometimes there's big sacrifice in worship. Okay. Yep.
A lot of times in offering and giving in the Bible, it doesn't make sense, especially with our culture today. Like you talk about Jesus and them witnessing a widow giving her last 2 denarii, right?
Right.
If someone walked into our church and said, this is my last $20 bill, tomorrow I'm going to go home and starve to death,
Yeah.
we'd be like, no, don't give that to the church. You should keep that. God doesn't want you to give that to the church.
Yeah.
And yet Jesus commended her on that, and that was an example for us
Yeah, if we only gave in what made sense to us, we wouldn't probably do a lot of giving. We would just do the bare minimum practical. Interesting what you said about giving your last $20 to church, because someone in our church who's not here today, but shared a story about their parents when they were younger and really struggling, and they literally had their last $20, and they felt like they were supposed to give it to the church, and so they gave their $20 to the church. And later on that week, someone sent them a check for $2,500 just out of the blue. Like, that kind of doesn't make sense to give your last $20 to the church, right? And yet in God's economy, it makes perfect sense.
I think that's where, when you value God's approval more than the stuff you own.
Yeah. I think all of us, as followers of God, should have examples of impractical giving, where we have given money where it didn't make sense to us, but we felt like God was saying we should give. Maybe I can go out on a limb and say that. I think we should all have examples where we gave impractically or sacrificially or something like that. Because I don't think God has changed from what we've read here in Leviticus. The way we give and worship has changed, but God hasn't. So let's shift gears in the last 10, 12 minutes here. We're going to talk about the third kind of giving in the Old Testament. We've talked about tithes, that's your 10%. We've talked about these offerings, which are these special, not quite spontaneous, but occasional gifts. And now the third type of giving is care for the poor. And so this is a whole separate section. It's not about tithing, and it's not about offerings. It's about how we care for the poor. And so I want to read what the Old Testament says to us about this topic in a few passages. Looking in Deuteronomy here first. At the end of every 7 years, you must cancel debts. If only our banks read Deuteronomy, eh? This is how it is to be done. Every creditor shall cancel any loan they have made to a fellow Israelite. They shall not require payment from anyone among their own people, because the Lord's time for canceling debts has been proclaimed. You may require payment from a foreigner, and we're going to talk about this next week, about the difference between God's people and not God's people, but you must cancel any debt your fellow Israelite owes you. So God is undoing long-term indebtedness of the poor to the rich. Today there's about 8.1 million people who are currently in debt slavery in our world, which means they owe so much money that they have to work for this person as a slave, and they will never pay down their debt enough to get debt-free. The interest will keep accruing faster than what they're paying it off. And so they're literally living in slavery in countries in Asia. And so God wants to undo this potential. So every 7 years, this is interpersonal loans between God's people. At the end of 7 years, you cancel it all. It reminds us that the money that was lent out was not theirs in the first place, that it was all God's to start with, and He can do what He wants. So, we could do this today. We can certainly cancel debts, and I know lots of us in this room have had debts that we've given to fellow believers that have been canceled, whether formally or it's been so long and you just know that money's never coming back. But when you do let go of a debt, you are doing what God told His people to do. They have a rule every 7 years. We can do this differently. He goes on, he says, there will be no poor among you if you obey. So God says, when you get into this land, if you guys live my ways, nobody's going to be poor, which is interesting. And then he says, if anyone is poor, because he knows they're not going to live in God's ways, among your fellow Israelites, in any of the towns of the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward them. Rather, be open-handed and freely lend them whatever they need. That's our attitude towards the poor. Be careful, he knows that we're going to see this loophole, not to harbor this wicked thought. The 7th year, the year for canceling debts, is near, so that you will not show ill will toward the needy among your fellow Israelites and give them nothing. So, if we're in year 6, and I come up to my brother Dave Hyde and I say, Dave, times are a little tight for me right now. Can you spot me $500? And Dave's thinking, oh yeah, I know why you want it now, because next year I got to cancel this. God's already thinking of that ahead of time. He says, no, don't be tight-fisted. Open your hand freely. Even if it's right before that year, we still give. That's impractical, right? But that's how we give impractically to one another. So this is more about lending money, not about giving, but the idea is that often when we lend to the poor among us, it's going to turn into a gift. And so God says, lend them that money, even if you know very well that money's never going to get repaid. Do it open-handedly. We can certainly live this out today. If you do that, if you're tight-fisted, they may then appeal to the Lord against you, and you will be found guilty of sin. Give generously to them, and do so without a grudging heart. Then, because of this, the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and in everything you put your hand to. There will always be poor people in the land. Therefore, I command you to be open-handed toward your fellow Israelites who are poor and needy in your land. I don't think I need to comment or expound on this very much. There's always going to be poor people among God's people. Open your hand. Be generous towards them. Another way that God's people were told to look out for the poor among them. He said, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field, or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time, or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So God commands lazy farming practices. Don't bother going all the way to the edge. This is obviously impractical now. It wouldn't make any sense for you farmers not to harvest to the edge of your field. No poor people are going to come along and harvest that. In those days where everything was done by hand, it made a lot of sense. And so you wouldn't go over your field a second time. You wouldn't go right to the edges. It brought God into your farming. When you dropped a grape, when you're picking all your grapes, you would bring God into that. You say, oh yeah, I can't pick that grape up. And you might actually drop a few more grapes because the poor will come along and they'll be thankful. And when you're harvesting your field with your sickle and you get closer and closer to the edge, God comes into that. And you remember, yeah, God said, don't go all the way to the edge. God doesn't say how big of an edge to leave. The more you want to leave, the more you can leave. But you realize, yeah, I'm not going to harvest that. God told me to leave that for the poor. And then the poor would come along and they would get to harvest. And they would get that grain and they would get those grapes that you've intentionally left behind. So this is, yeah, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, what about the poor that are poor because they've made really bad financial decisions?
Good question.
When I think about impractical giving, that would be one thing for me that I would find hard is, giving to somebody that maybe is poor, but maybe because they have put themselves in that position. What is our obligation as believers?
Okay, that's a great question that Jenna brought up, is about what about giving when it's actually maybe not the wisest thing to give to that person in that situation? So this is something that the deacons talk about all the time, right? Because they have people who come asking for money, and sometimes it's really wise and practical to, yeah, we want to help this person. And sometimes you realize, actually, this is probably not the place to be helping with a financial gift. So Scripture doesn't talk about why these people are poor. Why are they? Why would some of these people be poor? Let's just throw out some answers. Why was there poor people in the land? What could happen that would make you poor? You could have had a sickness. So the man of the house got really sick and couldn't plant his crop. How else could you get poor? A widow or an orphan? Yeah, your husband's dead. And yeah, whatever, good. How else could you get poor? What if there was no rain? Then you'd end up poor, right? You'd have no crops this year. There's just nothing. Locusts came, ate it all.
There was capitalism in that day too, where
Okay.
large enterprises owned everything and
Somebody took your land or pushed you off your land and you lost your land. An enemy came and stole your crops or burned your crops. There's lots of ways that, yeah, people could have been poor. Laziness is another one. So maybe that's kind of what you're coming on, right? Maybe this person's just lazy and they didn't want to bother planting a crop, and so they ended up poor. And so Scripture doesn't differentiate very much for us on which poor to help and which poor not to help. There is wisdom that we bring into some of these conversations, but the idea is there's going to be poor and we're going to be open-handed. Did you have your hand up there?
Well, I was just going to say the lazy aren't going to be going and gleaning the field edges or picking the grapes.
The lazy aren't going to be going and gleaning. That's good. Yeah, absolutely. And so there are lots of situations where giving someone a check isn't going to help them, but I'll sit down with you and I'll help you get a handle on your finances. I'll help you figure out why you are in debt. Maybe I'll help you get a job. There's lots of ways that we can help that go beyond just simply writing a check or giving cash. We'll get into this more, I think, as we carry on this conversation. But let me finish this. We're running out of time, actually. Maybe we're out of time. 6 years, you are to sow your fields and harvest the crops. But during the 7th year, this is another impractical one, let the land lie unplowed and unused. So hear that, farmers? Every 7 years, you get to take a year off. Then the poor among you, among your people, may get food from it. Again, they'd have to do the work to get it. And the wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. So there was a practicality. I think you farmers would know there's something healthy about letting land sit fallow for a year, right? Not anymore because we have other ways to get nutrients into the soil, but where there isn't that, fallow land actually does produce better in the following year. And God says actually in, where is this? Leviticus 25, he tells them to do this. He says, if you do this, in the 6th year, it will produce a crop sufficient for 3 years. So he says, if you live my way, in your 6th year, you're going to have such a bountiful crop that you can actually take that year off, and the poor can eat from the land, and you can eat from it as well. Okay, I'm just going to wrap this up. A few proverbs. Whoever shuts their ears to the cry of the poor will also cry out and not be answered. God wants us to listen to the poor. One who oppresses the poor to increase his wealth, and one who gives gifts to the rich, both come to poverty. Those who give to the poor will lack nothing, but those who close their eyes to them will receive many curses. So all throughout the Old Testament, there is a care for the poor. And it's mandated in how we do our farming practices and so on. But we're going to leave it there. Kids are coming back. We'll just carry on this conversation. Bring your thoughts and questions about the Old Testament. Next week, we're going to move on to the New Testament. Sound okay?
You never commented, Jeff, that if you leave your gleanings, you'll find a wife.
If you leave your gleanings, you'll find a wife. Yeah, that's right. Ruth and Boaz. Good. We'll end on that. Thanks, Dave.